Okay, I'm basically here only to make the human watch, the human clock. So the organization tells me that we have got 40 minutes for the keynote speech, then 10 minutes for the discussant, and then 10 more minutes for whoever from the floor wants to intervene, and I'll stick to that, and I'll try to be strict on that. My warmest welcome to Jasser Auda. You have got his bio here, so I'm only reading out the very first lines. He's professor teaching at the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies in Doha, and a founding member and a member of the executive board of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, and a member of the academic committee of the International Institute of Islamic Thought, a fellow of the International Institute of Advanced Systems in Canada. Then, if you are interested, it's a very impressive bio, and you can find all the information here. So, as I said, I won't take any more time, and I leave the floor to our first keynote speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. Hi. Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to express how honored I am and happy I am to be here in this conference and this prestigious college. I really cherish the approach that it's taking in terms of focusing on the elite of policy making. It's a very important area, and policy making does not take much emphasis in major schools around the world, and it's very important to have this emphasis. I'm really glad that I'm here and speaking. When we left the hotel with the group in order to be here, I realized that I'm in trouble. When Mohammed Hashas contacted me on Facebook about this conference, he talked about Imams in Europe and the issues of training and so on. And being the head of training in the International Union of Muslim Scholars, I thought I'm here to train Imams. But then when I walked into the room, I realized that no, this is not about training Imams, although I can recognize a few of our Imams here. But this is a policy talk. You can forget about the few lines I sent as an abstract, and let's talk policy. Because I think that this is a very important policy question. Imams in Europe, their training, their selection, their relationship with foreign countries, non-European countries, and how we can deal with this issue. Of course, I was going to talk about ijtihad and training and how to address your khutbah for the community. I'm not going to talk about any of this. I will discuss the question of policy. Number one point, and I will try to be briefer than 40 minutes so we have more time for discussion. I think this is a very important discussion. Number one question in policy for Imams in Europe is, what is the objective of this policy? It is very important to define the policy objective, as people say in policy sciences. Why? Why are we trying to train Imam in Europe? And what are we trying to achieve when we talk about training Imams or licensing Imams or including Imam programs in big universities in Europe? And I think the answer of the question of the objective has to do with the public value that the Imams add to the society. And I do not think that the objective of training Imams should be a political objective. I think that it should be the case that we separate the policy that has to do with training Imams from the politics that have to do with training Imams. I think that mixing the political question of the Imams in Europe and the policy question, even though it could be delicate to separate the two issues. I think that mixing both issues is not beneficial, and I think that this should be a policy question, a pure policy question that has to do with the public value that the Imams add to the society. And therefore, the dealing with the issue of Imams should not be, even though it's a very important issue, should not be a security issue. The security of European societies and the role that Imams play in that security is a reality, but we should not have this narrow approach in dealing with Imams only in terms of the security implication of dealing with Imams. Islam is the religion of 1/4 of human beings on this earth, and it's not only a security question to deal with people who carry a great responsibility of representing and teaching and working with Muslims and Islam in Europe. Also, I think that the objective that many governments in Europe announce as an objective of dealing with Muslim communities, and especially the question of Imams. I used to live in the UK before now living in Qatar or being based in Qatar, is the question of integration. I think that integration is loaded with politics if we do not define it very well, if we do not really question what do we mean by integration, and what do we want exactly when we deal with Imams, who of course deal with the Muslim community. When we talk about integrating Muslims into the European culture or the European society, I think this is a very important question. And I think that integration is great if we look at it in terms of contribution rather than assimilation. Some people look at integration in terms of trying to make Muslims, and if possible Islam itself in Europe, fit with a preconceived European identity and a well-defined European culture or sub-European culture, like the English culture or the Italian culture, for example. And I think that if we flip the question and we try to look at Muslims in terms of European Muslims, I mean in terms of contributors to the society, then the objective of this policy would be how can we make Muslims contribute more to our societies? Not only in terms of the engineers and doctors and technical people and workers and taxi drivers and so on who contribute to the big machine of the society, but also how can Muslims contribute to the culture in Europe, and how can Muslims contribute to the faith community in Europe. And I think this is an important contribution that Muslims could offer. And this is something that could enrich the European culture, the European faith, if we look at Muslims as contributors. And we look at this integration policy or policy that has to do with Imams or training or licensing in terms of how can the Imams be instrumental in terms of making Muslims contribute more to European societies. And how can the interpretation of Islam that the Imams introduce it could contribute to that goal. And in this case, it becomes much more of a common ground that we're trying to reach between the different agendas here, local agendas. I'm not talking about foreign agendas. I will try to address this point. But basically, we're trying to achieve more peace and more harmony and more diversity in Europe in this case. And then the objectives of this policy dealing with Imams, whether the governments or authorities decide to take a more interventive measure, training them or licensing them, etc., I think then that would create a much better outcome. If the objective is the contribution of Muslims and how Muslims could add to the diversity of Europe and the harmony of its people, and especially its culture and its faith. It's very important to be aware of what I could call foreign agendas when we talk about this policy question, because so many political entities in this world would love to have as we say in Arabic, a leg in Europe, a hand, a way of soft power via Muslims. And it is natural to for these countries or these forces outside Europe to want to contribute to learning the Arabic language or preserving the Muslim heritage in Europe that has something to do with their history. It is natural. But the policy has to be aware of the foreign political agendas. Again, separating the politics from the policy in this matter. And therefore, make sure that you don't have non-European interests trying to change the realities in Europe, or especially work through the Imams sometimes, unfortunately, on the minds of some uninformed youth for the sake of other agendas. I had a tour in the Balkans a few months ago, and I was in Germany 2 weeks ago, and I heard in different parts of Europe, in the UK, how the youth are leaving Europe, if you consider the Balkans to be part of Europe anyway, how they are leaving Europe and going to fight with Daesh, ISIS, call them in English, ISIL, and how many Imams in mosques played a role in this. And I find this to be a total disaster. For Islam, as a believer, I think that this is a disaster. Instead of Muslims in Europe contributing to Europe, adding to its culture and its faith, and contributing to Islam via that, and contributing to Muslims worldwide via that, we're having people who are trying to use the freedom or the value of freedom that they have in Europe in order to serve some other agendas, Middle Eastern, foreign security, whatever, intelligence, whatever you want to call them, agendas that are happening there in that part of Iraq and Syria and all of this mess. So I think that the policy has to be sensitive to the identity of Muslims in Europe, and not to mix the political question with making the society a better society, with producing public value in Europe, whether internal politics, European politics, or Middle Eastern politics, Arab politics, or Gulfian politics, or whatever it is that is trying to intervene in this policy. And if we approach this policy question with all this good intention of trying to ask how can Muslims contribute better to the European societies, then we can go to the technicalities of training and the question of training. I think that in terms of training Imams, I think we have two ways of looking at this. One, through the conventional universities and conventional institutes and academic centers and so on, where training Imams should be in the area of, if you wish, civil professions. If you're training Imams for the sake of working in hospitals or prisons or being chaplains or taking a profession that is more or less a civil profession, for lack of a better expression, excuse my English, then these universities could be the best places to train Imams for that. And here comes the question of whether a secular university could do religious training. And I think that this is one hurdle that policy has to overcome in terms of creating a stream of confessional training or education, in terms of allowing people to speak about their faith in a non-objective way, even though objectivity is a huge, obviously, dogma in Western academia. But dealing with these issues so that the institutes that are specialized in training and academic development in Europe could do the training for what could be called the civil side of imams, the civil professions. The other side of training that has to do with traditional training. Sheikh Khalid talked about there couldn't be an imam without him memorizing the Quran, for example. Traditional universities and big institutes in Europe would not be able to teach Quran and memorize Quran in the same way as an Islamic institute or Islamic university or Islamic center, whatever you want to call it. And therefore, the other stream of training should be Islamic universities, Islamic colleges that are indigenous, that are European. And I think also that policy has to deal with this question in terms of more encouragement for these initiatives going around in Europe. I see many small initiatives for building Islamic universities and Islamic colleges by people who are second-generation European, or people who don't have an external agenda, if you wish. And I think that this is very important for the accreditation of these universities. I'm not sure as what. In America, we have this seminary stream of education. I'm not sure if there is something similar in the European laws that have to do with accrediting Islamic colleges and making sure that they follow certain guidelines so that they can give this traditional training and traditional skills that big European universities cannot give, really, are not capable of giving. But also Islamic colleges are very important in what we call in the Islamic law ijtihad. New reasoning, new opinions, new ways of looking at Islam. They cannot come, with all due respect, from the big universities in Europe. They have to come from an Islamic university, from within, if you wish. From within in terms of methodology and in terms of the background training and the courses and so on, when students are able to offer new opinions. I see this emerging in the West, an Islamic madrasa, an Islamic school of thought that is European, like the schools of thought we had in the Islamic world that were different because of the different geography. The Indian school, the Arabian school, the Moroccan school, the African schools, and so on. There is a European school emerging, and I think it's important for the policy, again, to encourage that and give these Islamic colleges and Islamic training centers the legitimacy and the support that they need so that they can produce Islamic scholarship that is European and that serves this objective of Muslims to contribute to the European culture and faith. But on the other hand, and this is the final point, policy has to have another stream that has to do with culture. Allahu Akbar. Policy has something to do with another stream that has to do with culture. And allow me to say that, obviously, non-European person trying to propose some ideas, that I think that the policy that has to do with culture in Europe has to include an element of accommodating the idea of Muslims being part of the European culture. Now it's been a long time since Europe could talk about Muslims as workers or as, I'm seeing second and third and fourth generation of people who call themselves European. And they are, to me, as an Arab, they are European, they are not Arab, even though they are descendant of parents from whatever, the Arab world or India or at the end. But they are Europeans. And I think that the European culture, with all due respect to the great heritage of the European culture, has to develop in order to include Muslims, Islam, if you wish, as part of that culture. And as you know, in policy schools, culture has to do with education, culture has to do with the media, arts, all the cultural shapers that policy is dealing with. The policy of dealing with Imams and dealing with Muslims have to include some plans for changing the common perceptions of Muslims in primary education curricula, in the policies that have to do with the public, shaping of the public culture. And I think that this would add to what I'm trying to propose here, which is the Muslim contribution to Europe, would add more harmony and diversity, but the European culture has to expand a little bit and become more inclusive and more diverse. And this creativity would be for the better for the European future, as well as the Muslim communities who are here. So I hope you allow me these notes. And as I said, I prepared these on the way from the hotel to here, knowing that now this is a policy seminar and not a training seminar, and it's my fault that I misunderstood. But hopefully the question of policy and dealing with Imams could be researched well in those 2 days, and we all learn from each other. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And without further delay, I leave the floor to Mohammed for the discussion.
Yes, and that makes it difficult for me to move then. First, it's a great pleasure to share this session with Professor Jasser Auda. Well, yeah, the conference is, it can influence, it may influence, that's not up to the academics to decide, but it's, the idea is academic, scientific contribution, and we, as all academics aspire to, they wish that their ideas go into the field and influence positively policy making. But that aside, I have thought of the issue, and that's where my concern is, from more a theological perspective, or trying to think of it from a theological perspective. There are a lot of sociological, anthropological work, which is great. A lot of securitization of the issue of Muslimness and Islam in Europe. That's also another thing. There's a lot of Islamophobization. That's also well known. My interest in the idea of European Islam might go at the end of it to the policy making, but to arrive to that point of finding more detailed and shared points to make a policy, we always have to go to the abstract first, so that we can average it down. And that's where I'm fighting. That's where my fight as a researcher, young in the field. And my interest is in the ethical perspective. I mean, theological, but the ethical primarily. I think that without, especially that speakers before, and Professor Jasser also mentioned it, how to be contributors, or Muslims, or the pathways for their contribution. I think that for the last 200 years of debate over where Islamic thought could be directed to, what path to take, is still unsolved. We know that there is no one single religious authority that decides. We know the political agendas being involved, and we cannot assume that in the near future there could be one voice. So that's left for time, and all we do is that we work with what we have. My understanding of contemporary Islamic thought and what I see emerging Islamic thought, European Islamic thought, few good attempts for now, is interesting ones, is that there is a work on how to perceive ethics from an Islamic perspective. An old debate that is all the time brought up again by various scholars we call progressists or reformists, and that's where I see the deadlock. Traditionally, and that means that for some scholars of Islamic history of ideas, that's a medieval issue, and it stopped at the end with two main dominant schools, the Ash'ari and the Mu'tazili. And what I see that, for example, contemporary Islamic thought, and with reference to the Imams, who, with different backgrounds, with different skills they have, different geographies they come from, is that they are still trying to find a way out of keeping the ethical dimension as understood in Islamic theology, Islamic perspective, Islamic worldview, and how to integrate that into the European institutions. That's not easy, and that's what makes it difficult for the Imams themselves and for any religious authority that claims impact on Imams, if they are being imported or homegrown, or it's the same difficulty for, let's say, secular universities. We say that it's difficult for them to understand the Islamic perspective. Why? Because the ethical dimension on how they perceive ethics is different. So that European perception of ethics is different. And the dominant view until now in the Islamic perspective is the traditional one, and which put reason and revelation together, and that makes more Sharia prescriptions, Sharia law, part of the understanding of ethics. So that makes it delicate for also the young generation of Muslims that we know and we see now, for example, going back to join Daesh or ISIS, and even before that, the dilemma was there, even before the recent ISIS growth, etc. The dilemma is still there. How do the Muslim youth feel European, or they still, they are grown up, they have most of the European identity, they feel it, they defend it, but at the same time, at certain moments, they still feel that, well, the context in which they are, the soil in which they live is still different. Well, of course, the idea is not to facilitate and say, well, we drop all the theological issues, because the Imams also we are talking about, they haven't solved the issue. Not all the Imams have that theological. And we know traditionally, the next keynote will say more about that. An Imam in Islamic history is not a scholarly position. It's more, let's call it administrative. He is the person who leads the prayers. He follows what big scholars or the school, the particular land or institution he belongs to defend. So, but that's the dilemma that an imam in Europe still faces, and most of the imams until now are not homegrown. So they have the mindscape of the country where they come from, and that's different from the European mindscape. So they are talking in a different land and to a different generation, and that's where the issue is. I don't want to. I'm still fighting with that. But just to mention, it's an epistemological issue. It has an impact the idea that Imams or Islamic religious authority now is trying to defend the ideas of democracy and how and gender issues, I mean equality and liberty, doesn't solve it. Because it may seem, if I'm looking from an academic perspective, and they want to see some harmony in that landscape or in that mindscape, I still find difficulties in adjusting the Islamic worldview as traditionally defended with these, let's say, European values that are Muslims also now appropriating. So in appropriating these ideas of liberty, equality, social justice, there is very little still work on the theological, how to make these very convincing from a theological perspective. That's why there is always this fraction of fear that at the end we have these young Muslims joining the extremists or doing that, because there is that void that hasn't been filled from a scholarly and I think a theological perspective. For now, because of a number of more external issues, Muslim scholars are more in the defensive, so they haven't been daring enough to go into discussing again the idea of creed and the idea of freedom of conscience. There is a talk on that, but on the institutional level, and that's the perspective Professor Jasser Auda is as underlined in his presentation. On that level, there is that void that I see is emerging. There is work being done, but that's where the problem lies. And without discussing it further, that makes still reaching out to more understood and more agreed upon policy issues difficult. The gap remains, I think, strong. I could see that the chair is looking at his watch. Yes. So I would like to see what Professor Auda would say about that. Theological, where is the place of that? We cannot talk about, maybe, at least from my understanding until now, we cannot talk about ijtihad or renewal without discussing these issues from theological, ethical perspective. And that means that there should be kind of prioritizing of values within the faith boundaries, keeping the divine as sole source of inspiration, source of ethical contribution. But on the policy-making issues, it's more rational issues that have to be now underlined. And I wonder if Islamic universities, Islamic colleges are able to do that now. Of course, there are interesting attempts, but the dominant ones, I see them unable to do that. That's the main theological issue I would like you to react on, if possible, and I would drop all the others, some minor issues which we can discuss in coffee breaks and corridors and in the coming time, and that has to do with the work of the European Council for the Fatwa of Research and research to which you belong, and the theory of maqasid, how much there is reasoning in it, and I like the approach and the theories very much, but I wonder if that is not a theological approach, that is maybe I feel it's too much for Imams in the level in which they are now to provide them or to overload them with those theological issues, seeing the external agendas we all are aware of, I think. So I stop there. Thank you very much for the occasion.
Okay, so I leave the floor to Professor Auda for an answer to Mohammed Hashas, and then we'll open up the floor. We still have some time, so we can, thanks to Professor Auda, it was very, didn't take all the time that he was given, so we do have some time for discussing all that. Okay.
Well, thank you, Mohammed, for that. The question is about developing the new ideas and the new ijtihad in Islam. And I think the question here is where? Where can you develop the new ideas? The Middle East is in a transitional stage, and politics are very high there. You really cannot develop ideas, especially Islamic ideas, in the Middle East without a political side of these ideas. So if we are talking about maqasid al-Sharia and looking at the objectives and the intents and trying to renew the Sharia via looking at the rules as means to an end, you really cannot do that outside the West so far. My humble view. This book that we were talking about that I wrote, I studied that and I wrote about that in University of Wales in the UK. I wasn't able to write this thesis in other universities, including Al-Azhar, where I learned my early training, etc. I couldn't. These new ideas have to go through the filter of politics in the Arab world and in the Muslim world in general, all the way to India. And each country has its own politics and its own power struggles. And so in order to do that, I think that the Islamic colleges that I'm talking about in Europe are able to produce the theological arguments that you are looking for Europe. And they would be the most capable of doing that, even though they are very new attempts of trying to study Islam in Europe and trying to do scholarship in Europe, Islamic scholarship. But I think that the new Islamic ideas that are best for Europe have to emerge in Europe. You have to have, in Italy, for example, an Italian institute that works on the new Islamic Italian school of thought that is fit to this part of the world and its culture and the way they view things. And that's how Islam evolved from Mecca and Medina to being, to take a different form in Egypt, a different form in Russia, like the Islamic part of it, a different form in India, a different form in Africa, because it was indigenous there and it was studied. It's too much for Imams, yes, because we have a crisis. We have Imams, as I go around and meet with Imams, great people and very kind and so on, but most of them are not fit to be Imams in Europe. As simple as that. This is too much responsibility for them to lead. Like an Imam in Europe is like a Khalifa, I volunteered once, like some 20 years ago, when I used to live in Canada, to be an Imam. And I was overwhelmed by the responsibility. This is not like leading the prayers and that's it. People come to you with all sorts of legal questions and problems, and to divide the inheritance and to, deal with family issues and community issues. And you are an authority when you are an Imam. And there is no Amir al-Mu'mineen, in Europe to look at that except for the Imam. In the Muslim perception, nowhere, anywhere. But I'm saying in the Muslim perception, they come to you as an authority. And that is too much responsibility. That's why it's very important to train the Imam to be a leader of the community and to lead the community in a team effort, and not to have this person who is not qualified, who belongs to a very different planet from the European planet, and he is leading thousands of people with the most sensitive details of their lives. I think that's why you need policy. Thank you.
Okay, I open up the floor. Yes?
Thank you very much for these very interesting remarks to start us off here. I agree with what you're saying about ideas where Europe should be created in Europe. But I wonder if, I find it very interesting you're saying that the only place I'd be curious to have your view on attempts to renew Islam, especially coming from Southeast Asia, say Indonesia, Malaysia, because obviously that's a very different context than the Middle East, South Asia, which you referred to more directly.
Well, okay, Joe, sorry, just 1 second, because I've seen many hands, but I don't know you, so I am afraid we can collect maybe a few questions. So there was a hand there, then there were 2 other hands there, and 1 hand back there. And now don't add further hands, please, because otherwise as I said, I don't know you, so I cannot write down names. And okay, please.
Good afternoon, Yahya Pallavicini from the Muslim community here in Italy. Thank you for your presentation. Just a very brief background before my question. The question of ijtihad, the renewal of Islamic thought in contemporary times and context is, of course, I think, to put it right, a intra-faith debate. And I think this is quite the question I wanted to suggest to Professor Auda. But I quite disagree on the question that we have only the West as the solution, because it depends. There is an intra-faith debate also in Egypt and in Syria. As Maqasid al-Sharia was mentioned, I had the privilege to attend some teachings from former Mufti Ali Gumwa on Maqasid al-Sharia, and when the elections and the government changed, now he's not anymore, of course, a authority in the field. And the same thing would be also by another of my teachers, Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti, who was killed in the intra-faith so-called challenge. So I think that we have to put it clear which kind of policy and which kind of authority in the Muslim world we want to look for. And on the other side, and to make the question is, I think intra-faith also at the European level is very important, because as far as I could see in Cambridge and in Louvain, there are very interesting experiences in terms of theological thought, while sometimes, and this is the question, how far your Council for Fatwa and Research is open to an intra-faith comparative level of discussion and research, also among different approaches and trainings within the Muslim scholars in Europe. Thank you.
Okay, so there were 2 more hands there, and then I'll come to the other side. I'm sorry, but as I said, I need to a mental order, please.
I'm Sara. Follow up in a way on question following Yahya's question, because the idea of obviously renewing Islam is quite appealing and quite necessary in a way, but there is a high risk of fragmentation. Especially at a time when obviously we have access to the internet and everything, and when you see many young Muslims living in the West looking for models in the Middle East and not in the West. So they are rejecting a priori whatever is available to them, this variety of sometimes very sophisticated, very developed thoughts in order to go for something else. So yeah, the question is how do you address the challenge of diversity and the accusation potentially that Muslim intellectuals and scholars and Imams in the West could receive of actually being accused of going astray themselves.
Okay. There was another person there, so I'll then ask our speaker to answer. Then there is a question back there, a couple of questions here, and a question there, so we can group them, so we can have a 4th question, and then, okay.
I'll keep it very briefly, thank you. Well, thank you for your interesting talk. You discussed the definition of notions like integration and contribution, and you said you did not really give your interpretation of integration and contribution. You said integration is not assimilation, that's clear. Furthermore, you say it is especially from the Islamic world that, well, you know, Islamic centers and training centers should be organized because the know-how comes from there and not from here. then you say that Europe made it quite clear, like saying things like Europe has to become more inclusive and diverse. My impression is that you are saying that when it comes to integration of Islam in Europe, the responsibility you put more on Europeans instead of on Muslims. And I would like to hear your opinion about that, because if you insist on such a point, you might miss in the end the boat.
Sure. Thank you very much. The first three questions have something in common that have to do with what I meant by renewal or ijtihad. I'm saying that the renewal of Islam for Europe has to be done in Europe. The Middle East is struggling with very different questions. We're struggling with the notion of state. We're struggling with basic rights. And we're struggling with many issues that are Islamic too, but they are very different. And now, obviously, with the waves back and forth of the Arab Spring and the Arab Revolution, it's going to take some time until the Arab intellectuals materialize a new thought for the world, let alone for the Arab world. It's a process that it's taking time, that is taking time. I was saying that the political repression that is dominant in the Middle East does not allow new ideas to emerge. But they are emerging, and I'm hoping personally for a new wave of revolution starting from Egypt that could change the status quo in the Middle East, especially after learning a few lessons and the fall of the traditional Islamism that is not fulfilling people's aspirations. But in Europe, the ijtihad has to be European, and it has to come from this soil and from people who view the world through the lenses of European. I think this is necessary. I'm not saying that the only hope for Islam is in Europe, but I'm saying that Europe is very important in new Islamic ideas and new Islamic ijtihad, and that could come via European initiatives of education and research, not depending on the Middle East. I think it's a very bad idea to send European youth to learn about Islam in the Middle East. They come back and they cause so many problems because they come back with half religion, half politics, and they come with a mindset that does not fit with the European society and the European needs and the European community. Whether they come from Deoband or they come from Cairo or from Mecca, it's the same thing. And it doesn't work. So I think, the idea of the responsibility, yes, I'm not saying that the responsibility is only on Europeans. It's on Muslims, but they are Europeans too. I don't know how you view them, but basically Muslims who are Europeans have a responsibility. But I would say the responsibility is on Europeans, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, to really come together for a common ground that is best for Europe, for the communities here, for the betterment of these societies. Muslims who are not European are not addressed in my talk. I don't view them. They are a generation that will go anyway. It's one generation. But I'm talking about Europeans who are Muslims. I think Muslims and non-Muslims have to share the responsibility of defining a new Europe that is inclusive of Muslims and that produces its own new Islamic ideas. Very important.
Okay. So, I'm going in order of pronunciation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Paolo Branca from Catholic University of Milan. I do appreciate very much your contributions. Really, I'm here in order to learn something from the best European practice in this field. But I have, frankly, to say something about the Italian situation and the situation of my city, Milan. I follow last 30 years more than 50 years, the Muslim communities in Milan. And it's a very, very complicated. It's not so easy because I saw more concentration on rules than on values. And this is getting more and more after the Arab Spring. We risk to give the first official mosque in Milan, in the history of Milan, after 30 years of nothing, with right-wing parties, to anything with the left-wing parties, and we risk to give the first mosque to organization very, very close to Muslim Brotherhood.
Close to?
Muslim Brotherhood, Ikhwan al-Muslimin. The same who organize every week a demonstration supporting President Morsi. They are free to do whatever they want, of course, I do respect them. But this mix of politics and religion is very, very bad. It is led by Italian converted to Islam, or what's more, their songs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your talk, but I think I perceived a contradiction in your speech. On one side, you said that there is a European thought on Islam and a European Islam that should emerge from Europe. And on the other side, you said that university cannot bring something like that. It must be done in a Islamic institute or Islamic institution. I don't think that mosque and university are too far in Arabic, like Jamia and Jama are exactly nearly the same root. And the second thing is, I have a problem with the fact that the Muslim population in Europe is nearly trapped between this European citizenship and the country of origin. I think you didn't mention at all the cultural and national particularity of Islams, because we are not dealing with one Islam in Europe. We are dealing with many Islams, with the country of origin, with particular culture. Like an Egyptian Muslim is not a Tunisian Muslim or a Moroccan or a Senegali Muslim. So how can we deal with that issue? If you say that it should emerge from Europe, an Islamic institution will put it again inside the Middle East in a way or another, so we cannot just cut completely with the Middle East and with what political issues can bring inside of Europe. Thank you.
The lady was...
Maybe, and then you. My name is Rim Spielhaus from Germany, and I'm struck by two issues, and I think they will be issues of discussion during the conference. And this is, you mentioned the secular universities, and that there is a problem in European secular universities with religious learning. And I want to mention, I mean, there are several people from Catholic universities in the room. And in Germany, for instance, Protestant and Catholic theology are, of course, a core subject in many universities. So I think we do have to discuss how much or whether European universities are at all secular and what that means, and whether there is place for, and here would be a very concrete question, what exactly would it be that would be problematic for Islamic learning at European so-called secular universities? And the other question is that you did say that there is this focus on imams put on them from their communities, but I also can see that from politics within Europe and from academia, as we see in this conference. And I mean, I know that the conveners know me, so so I feel free to ask these awkward questions. Is imams the right focus then, or should we concentrate on broader terminology of authority when looking at Islamic issues?
Okay, thank you very much also for your talk, and I just want to add to a more complicating factor to that, and Riem already alluded to that a little bit, and that's in the beginning of your talk, you seem to make a kind of a distinction between the politics and the, well, the training, the theological issues. The problem at the moment is in European countries that it is, I mean, let me put it like that. It's not meant offensive, but maybe it's a bit too much wishful thinking, because I think that European governments not only want to intervene in the kind of organizing things, but also in the very content of, you know, there are many examples in many different countries where it goes much further than just saying, well, you know, here you have your theological faculty and good luck and all that. No, it's really, they really want a Islam, what I earlier mentioned in an article, a domesticated Islam, you know, that fits the kind of programs and the kind of imaginaries of countries. And I think that's a reality we have to face, and we cannot do away with that. But I just want to know your view on that complicated factor.
If I may, thank you very much. The first two questions deal with the same issue from two different sides. A side that is saying that Muslims are so busy with the Middle East politics and they are rallying for mercy and so on. And the other side is saying, but we have to consider the national identity of Muslims and therefore we have to rally. And I'm not talking about that. I think that the Muslims who don't identify themselves as Europeans have the right to rally for other things. Europe has been a place where refugees come and people who call for human rights issues around the world come and campaign, and it's you know, it's a place where you can have an influence. But this is not what I'm talking about. I am dreaming of a day where European Muslims are European Muslims, like they belong to this part of the world and they are concerned about it first and foremost. And I think on the longer term, this is best for Europe and for Islam, to be quite frank. If my motivation is the interest of Islam as a believer, I think it's best for Muslims in different parts of the world not to mix the issues and not to waste their resources and their lives in Europe campaigning for issues outside Europe that are very complex. I come from that part of the world. I know some of these people personally. This is not as simple as that. People campaigning for, I don't know, Sisi and Morsi and all of this Egyptian debate these days. This is a long story, man. And Europeans might have a take on it. This is fair enough. But it's best for the long term and for their own sake and for Islam, in my perspective, to focus on their societies and how to better their societies and how to be part of the contributors to their own societies. And I think that this is important. We cannot be cut from the rest of the world, it's true, but okay, yeah, the issue of universities. Germany could be an example for other European countries in terms of accommodating confessional academics and not caring about them being objective. I was at the University of Paderborn just 3 weeks ago talking, and I gave this note there that I'm speaking about theology in a German university. I do appreciate that. When I spoke about theology in different American and European and even Arab universities, I had the first question, it's like, okay, you come from a subjective perspective, you're not objective, what's your methodology and all of that. And I think that this is a political question, again, in order to marginalize people with faith. Whatever the faith it is, you cannot, I was told by a professor in America, you cannot be a believer of the Quran if you're going to talk about the Quran here. And that is one of the bigger universities in America, without mentioning names. And I felt quite offended. Because I'm a believer of the Quran, I cannot talk about the Quran in your university. I told them that this is too extreme in trying to be secular and objective, and you end up losing objectivity at the end, because you are not including all voices. And I do believe that objectivity is achieved by some sort of a collective subjectivity if we're going to get into this issue. And that the dichotomy of objectivity and subjectivity for me is a false dichotomy. We don't need to think in terms of this duality. Anyway, it's wishful thinking, it's true, I'm dreaming. But I think on the long term, it's very important to take care of that European Islam without politicizing it with the security question. I get shocked sometimes with European politicians campaigning and including issues like the niqab or others just to gain votes. You know, I find it, well, that's what politicians do anywhere. Anyway, they try to get votes or power or whatever. But that is not fair to European Muslims. I think they can develop something that is very unique and that Muslims around the world could learn from, and that is European and integrative to the European culture and faith and contributive. So governments would want to intervene, sure, but hopefully we can affect policy by making it more of a public issue. That stop using Muslims for your political campaigns. Consider Muslims to be part of your societies that you are trying to serve. And bringing ethics to politics is a very big and impossible endeavor sometimes, but hopefully we can bring some ethics to the political discourse that deals with Muslims in Europe. So I hope I covered some of these points. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm very sorry I have to close the debate because our time is over.